My name is Steffi and I chat to video game developers. On this episode, I speak with Pat, creator and game developer of the Masters Pupil. The Masters Pupil is a hand-painted adventure puzzle game which is set in the eyeball of the famous impressionist painter Claude Monet. I'm super excited to chat to Pat, not only because the Masters Pupil is a beautiful game, but also because Pat is a fellow Aussie and the first Aussie I am interviewing. This is a two-part interview. You are currently watching part one. In part one, we discuss how it took Pat 7 years to finish this game. We talk about the importance of language in video games and the different ways game developers can speak to players. We discuss the unique concept of video games being one of the very few forms of art where the player has the ability to be the main character of the art, and we discuss much, much more. Links to the gameplay of the demo and the game are in the bio below, and link to part two of the interview is also available in the bio below. Unfortunately, I do need to provide a bit of a disclaimer as I did experience some technical and internet issues while recording this interview. There is a bit of a delay between Pat and myself. It's not too painful. Despite this, I do hope you do enjoy the interview. Don't forget to beam me up, crew. Support this channel by hitting the subscribe button and by also hitting the thumbs up. Can I ask, how long have you been playing video games for?
I've been playing video games since the early 90s. I was trying to work this out because the first video game I remember is Alex Kidd on the Sega Master System 2, I think it was. It was like the cheap version that they sent out. And my older brothers, so my nonna, my grandma, she got it from, she had it to distract us, I think, because I'm one of four boys. And so the two older brothers would be playing that all the time and I would be sitting there with them. So this would have been early 90s. I would have been like 3 or 4 or something. And yeah, that's when I started, or that's the first kind of game that I remember.
Do you still play that game to this date, or has it been a while since you played that game?
It's actually really hard. And I played it, I got a ROM of it, there was some kind of there was a redo of it. They had redone it and re-released it. And they had put a save system in it because that game is brutally hard. If you die 3 times, you have to restart the entire game again. So it was just brutal. And so I was just I tried to, but I couldn't get back into it.
I was going to say, it's brutal for a young kid, let alone an adult. So tough
and I think
as a kid.
Back then, when you those games, a lot of those games, the classic one that everyone thinks is really hard is this the Lion King game on the NES or something, SNES or whatever it was, and that was really, really difficult. And I think those games were just you just bought one game every season and it was just so hard that you can just work on it for months and months and months. They didn't want you to finish games. Right now it's they kind of guide you and make sure that you can finish it. Then it was no, it's just going to be hard and you're just going to have to deal with it. So yeah, I don't know.
What are you currently playing and what is the next game on your list that you are going to play?
I'm currently playing Jedi Survivor. And I'm kind of stumbling my way through it because my gaming laptop at the moment, can't really handle it very well. So it's really struggling. And so every so often it'll just on a hot day, it'll just crash and not really work. And, I'm kind of it's awful. But it is a really cool game. And I think next on my list, I really want to play Enshrouded, which is that new crafting game that's coming out. I think I'm going to wait a little bit to get over its teething issues. But that's that kind of crafting. They've got this new way of crafting with voxels and stuff, which I'm very keen on that.
Do you work in the video game industry?
I do work in the video game industry. I am an indie game developer. So I am working in the very, very smallest corner of the industry and away by myself. Yes, so I am making my own indie game. So last year I released The Masters Pupil, and it is a hand-painted, 2D puzzle game set inside Claude Monet's eyeball. and a very little niche game that went surprisingly well. And so now I am using that capital to essentially make my next game, which is very exciting.
Oh my God, there is so much to unpack here. I didn't even know you were making another game, which really excites me. So, your game is going crazy on the internet. You have hand painted the entire game. I'm guessing you're an artist. Are you a classically trained artist?
I guess so. I went through a Bachelor of Creative Arts, and majored in painting. But I think when someone says classically trained, I feel like you were kind of doing still lives with oil and oils paint, and like really getting into the nitty gritty detail. It was like I was doing like conceptual art, so it was, even though I majored in painting, it was all very kind of do your own thing and write some special words about it. And so it was a kind of a process of very much like not hippie necessarily, but very, very creative, very artsy. And so I've come from that background, but then I went through a diploma of film at the Australian Film, Television, Radio School. And I was intending to kind of go into the film industry. But then I kind of did an about turn slowly and got into games because there was something that I could do by myself in my room and just chip away at. It was a creative pursuit that involved everything the same way film does, like acting and writing and sound and music and cinematography. But then it also added in animation and, coding. And then, the beauty of actually being able to play it. So it was something that I was always kind of interested in. And then, I got the opportunity, or I had this idea of a game set in an eyeball, and I thought, that's a really cool idea. Maybe I could try and do something, And around this time was like when Braid and Limbo were coming out, this like indie apocalypse, 2010, 2012, somewhere around there. And other people were doing it. I thought, oh, maybe I could do that too. That'd be cool. So let's try and give this a go. And then, 10 years later, I put out a game, essentially.
I've spoken to a few game developers, and some actually have come from the film industry, and they actually say that both industries overlap and there's similarities. So it's interesting that you're also confirming that. I guess some of the skill sets you would have learnt have been practical in game development too.
Yes, and I think it's a similar like visual language as well. Like, the idea of having something on screen is there's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of kind of cinematic tools that you can use in games. And so, and I think, and then let alone kind of animation and, 3D kind of, computer animation, that kind of stuff is kind of like, there's a lot of crossover there, and there's a lot of kind of, definitely. I'm not surprised really, especially because like the Australian film industry is big, but it's kind of like top heavy. There's a lot of big films that come through, and getting up to be working in those films is kind of difficult. So I think you start finding leeways around that, or different avenues that you can go down. And so when I realized that I could do gaming, or that was something more tangible, or something like that I could work on, without a film crew, or without, having to set up a film crew for a singular weekend, suddenly like I could make a game just in my bedroom. I was like, well, that seems epic and interesting. Like I could make this kind of fairly large scale thing. Without the need to hire a cinematographer and and actors.
I completely appreciate that. You saw an opportunity and you ran with it, but also game development is tough as well, and you're in the trenches by yourself. So well done.
Thank you.
This is a loaded question, and I know it's such a loaded question, but I'm curious to understand what you love about video games and what you hate about video games, whether there's one thing you can kind of discuss.
There's too much to love about video games. I think I kind of touched on it before when I mentioned like that at the end of the day you get to play it. And I think there's so many, like it's so integral to what a game is. Like obviously you get to play it, but I think there's so many kind of art forms out there that you can experience in different ways. But you're not the lead character. Like if there's some kind of like, I don't know, some kind of art installation that you get to experience and get to interact with, usually people experience by standing there and watching other people interact with it, which is a big way people experience games. You know, like Twitch is massive, blah, blah, blah. But for games, it's like they're not a thing unless you interact with them, right? So they're not an art form until you actually bounce up against it. You pick up the controller, you put your hand to mouse. You know, like, unless you do that, there's no way of actively experiencing the artwork. Secondly, oh, sorry, not secondly, but to your other point, which is that what I don't like about games, is that I think I was trying to put a finger on this concept because I don't know if it's like, if I'm going to make sense of this, but it's essentially that the expectations that are put on games, both good and bad. So I think there's expectations from viewers that they want a certain amount out of games. The players, you know, like they expect something from like AAA games or even indie games, and comparatively to what they've been marketed as well. So people have like this high expectations of what they're going to get. And then the reverse of that is the expectations developers have for audiences. Because I think, especially at the moment, we're in this time where games are being kind of pumped out a lot. Like there's many, many games being made. A lot of indie games and a lot of AAA games and a lot of in between. But what we're getting from the AAAs is the same thing being made over and over again, and the same expectations that players are idiots. They're just there to be entertained, and everything that is being given to them has to be like drip fed. So they're kind of there's no thinking involved, and that in turn feeds people. The more that they play games like that, the more they expect to not think, to just have an experience given to them, and those two things kind of, I think, create. The further that's going on, and that's been going on for like maybe 5, 6, 7 years, the more that's, or if not longer, the more that goes on, I feel like there's just worse and worse games being made. You know, there's nothing like picking up like a really interesting idea for a AAA game. You know, like I played like Far Cry. I like a Far Cry game, right? They're great. I've been playing all of them since I think the third one or something came out. Really like them. They're really interesting. But now I have to, when I get on, I have to turn off all of the UI, the HUD, you know, the graphic user interface, anything that comes up and pops up. Because whenever I'm playing that game, I'm being constantly bombarded by bits of information around the, you know, in the world. You know, there's someone down the road 100 meters and they're hiding in that bush. And you're like, can't I just run down and be surprised by that dude in the bush? Like, why do I have to know that he's there, you know? And there's all these great things that you can do. Like, you know, I was playing Far Cry 5 or whatever it is, the one in America. And I'm walking around, I had everything turned off. And suddenly you can actually hear, because the sound design is phenomenal in those games, you can actually hear people. You can hear the guy down in the bush. You can hear people talking from really far away. So you can kind of get the drop on them and sneak up on them and whatnot. Without being told what to do. You know, you're just getting to experience the game and on this other kind of fundamental level. And so I think that's happening in all different ways to all different AAA games. Mm-hmm. And I think it kind of, again, feeds into a lot of like super interesting indie games that also get that effect. Like, oh, suddenly you have to live up to the hype or some kind of like language that is being described by these AAA games. Yeah, it's just a difficult kind of feedback loop, I think.
I think that's a really interesting concept, and I was not expecting you to use an example like that. So if we go back to the concept of expectations from both the players, the gamers, as well as, I guess, the game devs, and then also your comment, I can't remember the exact comment, but potentially game studios thinking the players are dumber than they actually are, but you said in a more articulate way. Did you have that in mind when creating your game? Did you give the gamer more respect in assuming that they were more intelligent than they are?
Yes,
I guess?
Yes. And like I think I said it earlier, but that idea of language, like how you communicate with your audience, right? And so I think there's a very important way and expectations that you set up in a game, how you describe things to the player and what you expect them to do. So in the Master's Pupil, it's a game without any language. There's nothing describing how you interact with the world. You just have to bounce up against it, and you just have to experience it in that way. In the Master's Pupil, I made sure that everything in the game was descriptive. And in a moment that I wanted to just put up like a little text box saying, hey, this is a door. If you are colored red, you can walk through this door, right? That to me took away from the fundamental kind of idea of what puzzle games are about. Because for me, a puzzle game is that eureka moment. It's that, aha, I've solved that puzzle, right? It says it on the box. It's a puzzle game. So if you're removing a scenario with description, you're moving a scenario where someone can solve a puzzle, then you're removing a puzzle that they can solve. It's as simple as that. So if I had put up, this is the way that this door works, I could also set up a puzzle that describes the way the door works by a trial and error method, right? So that first level, the first 3 minutes of the Master's Pupil, has the player run up, and there's a little gap, and then there's this red jet thing, right? Spewing, and it looks like fire, so people want to jump and avoid it, right? So you jump across it, and then the only thing there is this breathing thing. It's this, I call them sniffer doors, but nobody knows they're sniffer doors. It's just that they're doors and they also sniff you. And so the idea is that you run up to this thing because there's nothing else you can do. You just have to bump up against it. And then it sniffs you and sneezes you out of the way. And that pushes you then into this red draft, this red jet of smoke. It colors you red. And then the only thing you can do after that is go back to the door. And then it sniffs you again. It sniffs the red off you. You change back white again. And then the door goes and collapses to the ground, and you can pass through it. So that's an opportunity to go, well, this is how this thing works. And that's a puzzle that people can solve, and they get that eureka moment after it. They solve that, and they go, oh, okay, I understand the way these doors work, and they can play the rest of the game. And so the entire game is essentially more and more tutorials stacked on top of each other until you're kind of, towards the end where everything is all kind of stacked, and all those, and I kind of took the training wheels off, and I, ran with as many hard puzzles as I could, because I got to the moment where it's like, okay, I've taught you everything I can. Now it's the hard stuff. So, yes, I think to kind of circle back to try and answer your question, it's basically, I think there's a language that you set up with your players, and if you tell them too much up front, then they're going to expect that down the line. But in the Master's Pupil, I set that up. All those languages, all that communication I had with the player was only ever about puzzles and about solving those puzzles and about understanding mechanics really one step at a time. And so I wasn't necessarily treating them like they were smart. You have to try and guide people as much as you can. And seasoned gamers will kind of run through the first two levels of the Master Pupil pretty quickly. But I've had people really stumble in the first 15 minutes because they just don't understand the kind of gaming language. And so, yeah, right? So there's all sorts, right? And I've had 9-year-old, or 5-6-year-olds get on there and just wizard through it. And then I've had, 40-year-old men come on there and be like, oh, this isn't COD, so there's a kind of, there's this kind of language that you need to set. And I don't think AAAs are dumb down their language really, really far. Whereas I think they could pull that back and still have a smooth game that's not necessarily fed to you. I think there's a difference between feeding and communicating right, which is, I guess, a whole nother kettle of fish.
I completely appreciate that. And I'm not going to lie, I haven't finished the game. I've played the demo, I've started the game, but the reason why I haven't finished the game is because it is difficult. And when you talk about when you talk about language, I agree. I think it's a very beautiful, delicate, but also it's a game that encourages you to push yourself, but in a delicate and beautiful way, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That's a
So
great
yeah,
compliment. I
yeah.
love that. Yeah, like it's all about the puzzles, and so I tried to make everything else really easy in the game. There's no puzzles that are timer based. You don't have to like rush through as a door's closing or anything like that. So it's all about just the logic of the scenario. And I tried as hard as I could to like introduce all those things. And there are sticky points. There's points where like I was like, I can't really describe this mechanic, this puzzle any better before it. But you just have to kind of hit it and then just work it out. And I think the hardest thing is like, this is a niche game, this is a niche puzzle game. It's a niche concept, being about like an impressionist painter, but it's also, it's a puzzle game. So I don't, it's not necessarily for everyone. And it's interesting talking to, podcasters, because a lot of podcasters aren't necessarily puzzle gamers, right? So there's this kind of like, you're butting up against it because it's not necessarily the game that you would play had you not talked to me. So there's a kind of, again, it comes down to that language and expectation thing as well. So making sure that someone who wants to play the game buys the game, like they're going to actually want to actually have this experience. And it's the kind of experiences that they look for or they search for. But yeah, I really like that compliment. That's great.
I guess I'm taken back by your comment of people are playing this game that would not usually play this game, because when I play the game, I sit there thinking that a young kid could play it, like a 5-year-old could play it, a male could play it, a female could play it, like whatever gender you are, an older person, 60, 40, even though that's not old, I'm like shooting myself in the foot. But anyway, I feel as though you've got every demographic, every age group captured. So I feel as though it's a game for everyone.
Yeah, and like that was intentional as well. Like I said, like I didn't want to make the game physically hard to play. There's left, right, and there's jump.
Yeah.
Like that's it. That's all the game has. And even on the Switch, I made it so every button, every button on the right jumps, every button on the left runs. So you can, run with the D-pad, you can run with the sticks, and you can jump with literally anything else. So it's a very easy way to play it, and that was intentional again because. Same thing with the language, right? I got to release on like 120 languages or something because there's no language in the game. Wow. And so I just had to make the storefront work with Steam's storefront, and then I could click literally every box. Like, the game's in Afrikaans, apparently. It's not. It's just that there's no language. Even the menu is icons. So I can I can just put it to everyone. And again, that was intentional because I wanted to release the game to everyone. Again, because it's niche, it's a niche concept in a niche genre, and so if it can be available to everyone, then more people have the opportunity to buy it. Because if it's you think about it, the Venn diagram of people who are interested in Claude Monet or artsy kind of games, people who are interested in the puzzle games, and people, if I made it then really, really difficult to play, the people that are into hard games, you're adding another circle to the Venn diagram of making that small, little gap kind of, even smaller. So, yeah, it was intentional to try and make the game interesting. And it's interesting about the puzzle thing because, the older people who played it, they'll go, oh, I'd be at I'd be demonstrate, I got the opportunity to show the game at the Powerhouse, right? And so I had all these different people come in and play it, and I could just sit there and watch them do it. And so I had the older people come through, all the gamers, so they're 40 to 60 or whatnot, and they'll die the first time, and they go, oh no, and then they go to hand me back the controller, and I'm like, you can keep going, and they're like, oh, can I? Oh, okay. And then I had kids that just died repeatedly, just die, and then they'd go then there's work it out, and then they'd be like, oh great, keep going. So there's this mentality, I think, especially with little kids, is they're kind of learning by smacking up against something. That's how they fail to learn. That's how little kids learn. So when older people do that, they kind of have this oh no, I failed. and that's bad. And I'm like, no, you just, there's nothing else to do there. You had to die. Like, you had to experience that so you knew that that was death, like, or that was the wrong thing. So, there's that kind of trade-off that you have to go through. Again, probably back to the whole language thing, right?
I totally get that. And I think the anxiety I had of like dying and thinking I had to start the whole game again, but knowing I didn't was very encouraging. So thank you.
Yeah. And that was another thing too, right? Like someone asked me, like, if you, why did you put like when you die, you only start like that puzzle. I was like, yeah, because I don't hate people, right? Like, I don't want to, like, you don't want to have to restart and then do the last, like, 4 puzzles again. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, you need to be able to die and restart really quickly because the death mechanic, at first I didn't even want there to be a death mechanic in the game. But at some point I was like, I need to have a way of restarting puzzles because if you get in there and switch a whole bunch of stuff and you don't know what you're doing, usually the puzzles are set, especially early on, the puzzles are set in a way that help you understand the way it works. So the first thing you switch sometimes is a little clue to show something or whatnot. And so...
And I was just going to say, some of the puzzles do take a long time to complete as well. Some of them aren't easy.
Yes, there's like this kind of process, and to be honest, they're the ones that I don't like the most. Like they're the ones I kind of like, I go back on and I'm like, oh, because it comes down to that thing, right? If you have to, like, there's that one that has like, I don't know where you're at, but there's this certain puzzle that has like a green block, a red block, and a blue block, and you have to move them through at a certain order. And if one fails, then the whole thing fails. And I was like, that's bad puzzle design. That's sloppy because it's so much resetting and there's less trial and error. And I feel like trial and error is really, really good. But at a certain extent, you don't want people just to have to laboriously repeat something over and over again. And that's what I don't like in games. So when I have it in my own game, I'm like, ugh, struggle.
Going back to, I guess, the sales and distribution and marketing side and just talking about how many languages you could technically release this game. I don't want to talk much about the new game because hopefully I'll have you on to talk about that new game, but are you going to have that same approach for the new game so you can release it in multiple languages again?
I really wish I could because I think it was an accidental like lucky streak kind of thing for that game because the way it's such a fundamental part of the way puzzle games work. And so, my next game is it's a much broader, it's open world 3D kind of procedural generated kind of sandbox kind of a game. It's not a puzzle game in that way. And so, I really wish I could and I thought of different ways, but that text kind of environment of like describing things to people, whether it's spoken or text or whatnot, that is a very short, it's a shortcut to playing the game in the way that is intended. So to have a tutorial, because, like the first, I don't know, technically speaking, I think the first like half an hour of the Master's Pupil is probably a tutorial. And then there's several tutorials through it. Again, they're not told to you that they're just played out as puzzles, but there's purposeful things that I'm trying to teach. And it's a linear game, so I can have A where I want A to B, and then B, and then C, and then D. I can lie them all out in a line. Whereas if you have an open world you're just experiencing, you might hit D first, and then you haven't explained what A is, and then vice versa and whatnot. So, there's a kind of there's a web that you have to untangle with open world games. But yes, I wish I could do that because it is really handy and it's very cheap when it comes to localization because, I can't remember the final what I paid for it, but I had to translate the store page on Switch and on Steam. Those two storefronts, I had the same 3-4 paragraphs that I just translate. I got someone to translate, a company to translate it into 30 languages or something. And then, like I said, I could just tick all the other languages because they don't have special, storefronts. And so I'm waiting for someone, but I don't know if they will be able to email me. I'm waiting for someone that doesn't know English, that only knows some really specific language, really excited that they were going to get a game in like Afrikaans, and then they get it and there's no language in it, and they're like, damn, I thought I was finally going to get a game in Afrikaans. But yeah, so sorry to those people. Not that they would understand this podcast, so it's a vicious cycle.
Very true, very true. I guess with the game, your color choices, it's all strategic. It's all, I guess, chosen for a specific reason. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the game is all about it's about color theory. So it follows the life of Claude Monet, the painter,
yeah.
And he was the first painters, first of a group of painters to start abstracting color apart. And so, where you would have an environment where there was a kind of like, a sunset and like the way of painting that was to paint it very like realistic and make sure everything was like well blended like it is in real life. It's not often that there's like splodges of color, just plain blocks of color. But the Impressionists, they started doing that. And so, coming from art, I like art, I like colors, I like painting. And so I kind of wanted to use color theory as the basis of the way these colors work, these mechanics work, and the way these puzzles work. And so I set up this, like, again, it's part of the way the game rolls out, but, and it's the way real life works. It's, blue and red make purple, and, orange, yellow and red make orange, and, the complementary colors. And so mixing and combining these colors in different ways and setting puzzles around them. So, there's these kind of base set of the primary colors and then the complementary colors that sit on top of that. And so, yeah, it was this kind of purposeful way of like reducing, getting basic color theory and reducing down to complex color theory, getting basic color theory and making kind of like abstract kind of puzzles out of it. So, yeah, it was a long process, but that's one of the things I'm kind of most proud about the game is like how that kind of came about and the thoroughfare of that, or the kind of the through thread of that kind of mechanic, and how I kind of utilized that.
I think it's also very educational. I feel as though I have done a masterclass in color theory and moving the crystals. Every time I got it right, like I made purple, I made orange. I was like, yes, I'm getting it right.
I did it.
So cool.
And it's really interesting because we were talking about like, teaching people how to do mechanics and that kind of thing. The first batch of people I had play tested, this was before everything was kind of painted. It was just like a lot of like block colors and blocks, that were just like a green block and, very basic kind of shapes. And I took for granted how much I understood color theory and that, that all these things, these colors mixed to these colors. And, I had a friend of mine who was testing it. He died at one point. And he's like, oh, okay. So if I mix more than 3 colors together, it makes black, and that will kill me, right? And I was like, no, I've taught you the wrong thing here. Like, it's not, and so it's like, I had to go back, and then I think it's in level 2, the 4th or 5th kind of individual puzzle, is this like little snake kind of shape that you have to move through. Yeah. And it basically spells out the color theory concept, and what will kill you, and what won't, and that kind of thing. So it was a way of, I had to go back and put that in. So I was very specifically teaching people what this thing was, because, I'd taken it for granted, basically.
Absolutely. I found it extremely educational. I guess it's a bit of an obvious question, but I'm just so curious. Why Claude Monet? Like, you could have chosen
Well, I don't know if it is an obvious question, because, I think there is a lot of options there. And especially because, like, I chose Claude Monet it was a continuation of an idea. So I started with a game set inside an eyeball. I had these ideas of a little visit from the cat. Hello.
Sorry.
No, that's cute enough. So yeah, I originally started a game, set inside an eyeball. That was the first idea, right? So I saw these images of like irises really close up, human iris, and these kind of like strange valley shapes. And it looks like this giant valley, and I thought it would be really interesting to set a game in that world, like on the colored part of a human eye. And then next, the idea was like, well, if I started at someone's birth on the edge of the white section, their life is the colored section.
One sec, I've got to get rid of these cats. I'm so sorry. Can you wait 1 sec? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, go for it. No, that's okay. That's so funny. For the people at home, Steffi is currently wrangling 2 cats. She's running around with 2 cats, literally picking them off her keyboard and sticking them outside the room. It's fantastic. It's podcasting at its best, to be honest. It's like when the guest is left alone, because then they can just rag on the client.
I was doing so well. Sorry about that.
Right, I left a little message for you in the when you were away.
What? I don't even know this.
I just when you come back and listen to it. No, when you come back and listen to it, I gave a little.
Oh, okay, cool.
I gave a little.
Cool.
Gave a little rundown to the listener.
I love that. Where were we? Far out. So you were explaining that Claude Monet is an obvious choice.
Yes. So basically, Claude Monet is like he was the end of a line of reasoning, or like a stacking of kind of concepts on what I was going to make as this game. Because, like I said at the start, like I thought of this game when I was making short films, and I was like doing all this other stuff, and it was such a long process making this game. Especially once I had the idea of the game, it took about 3 years before I even started working on it, right? So there was these concepts that kind of built up on top of each other. The first one was that it was a game set inside an eyeball. I saw these images of an iris, of a human iris, and it looked like these little valleys. And so I wanted to kind of, I was thinking that would be a great landscape for a game. This kind of human eye, really, really small. You could deal with all these kind of like strange creatures and like microscopic world kind of thing. And then I thought, well, if you also played with time as well, and you started the game at someone's birth, at the edge of the white section, and then the colored bit is their life, and then the black kind of pit of a pupil is their death. It's kind of it's a metaphoric kind of like nice little environment, right? And then you could like play, over someone's whole life. Maybe they lived in an interesting time, and you could kind of have that incorporated in the game. And originally I was thinking maybe they could start, this person was born maybe World War One or World War Two, and then kind of lived through the, civil rights era and into the like technological era and stuff like that. But I was like 23 or 24 or something, and I was like, I can't write the story of like an old man and like a full life. Like it seems like not, I'm not capable of that, right? So I figured, well, maybe I can find someone and set it in their life, and use them as like inspiration. And that's when I kind of came across Monet, or remembered Monet from my art school days, because I remember that he had cataracts, and so quite famously had cataracts. This like painter, famous in his own, era, that suddenly was losing his eyesight. And if I set this game in an eye, at the end of the game, while the cataract is forming, I can have like the player climb up into like a cataract castle and have that as like the end game, as like the big bad for the game, So all these kind of layers, right? Layers of like making the game and the concept of the game much more interesting than just an idea of a set inside an eyeball, right? So that's where I kind of fell across Monet, and that was when I decided I should paint it, because then I can match it with Monet's works. I can involve his artworks into the game, and I can get something out of my degree of painting, of majoring in painting.
Expensive degree.
Yes.
I guess we haven't even touched on the painting side, which I do want to get into. But before I do that, there are so many layers of the game that I absolutely love. And one of the things I do love the color theory that we previously discussed, but I also really love how the game forces you to admire his pieces of work. It's absolutely amazing. His stuff is amazing. And I guess, was there a criteria you stuck by in terms of choosing what pieces of art you wanted to illustrate? Because they were all beautiful, and what I found myself doing was just sitting there pausing and just admiring the art, like, oh my
Yeah,
god,
he
just
makes some
staring at the
great stuff,
screen.
doesn't he?
Mm.
He's like another reason like I settled on Monet too because or like really chose him is because he's just got such beautiful art. Like I don't think anyone stares at a Monet and goes yuck, that's gross. Like I did like it's such beautiful art, right? Like it's just you can't get over it. And so I yes to choose his artworks was really difficult because I was choosing. He was really prolific. He painted hundreds of paintings throughout his whole life, if not thousands. Like it was, he just painted so much. He had some certain key paintings that I wanted to hit, some favorites as well as just like really famous ones. Luckily, they were available. But the thing that was stopping me a lot, especially early on, is just the availability of high res images of his artworks. So it was this really like technical limitation of like what I could choose, what I couldn't. There were certain images that I really wanted, certain like story beats in a way that I wanted to pick out. I don't know if you played the like purple section, like level 8, but there's this painting of his wife on her deathbed, and it's this kind of like really poignant moment in his life that he did a painting of. And I had read this whole sequence about how, in a letter to a friend, he was sitting there next to his wife that was dying. She was dying of tuberculosis or something. And in this letter, he said to his friend that I'm sitting next to my wife, and all I could think of was how I could mix the paint to match the color of the purple of her lips. And I was like, oofed. Like that is such, like it points to how obsessive he was about color and about his craft and about painting, that even in that environment, he couldn't get out of his head about like crafting and his art, right? And so there was beats like that I wanted to hit, important things that happened in his life. And again, that's not described in the story, but I wanted to hit that somehow, right? And so I really needed that painting because that's the key of all that, right? So that sequence doesn't say all that, but it shows you that painting. It gives you a moment with that painting. And so I had to track down like 4 or 5 different versions of them and like overlay them over top of each other and try and get all the colors exactly right, because there just wasn't a nice big high res scan of it anywhere on the internet. So yeah, so that was the technical kind of limitations. But then also, my favorites, as well as like, it was hard whittling down because like later in his life he started doing all these series. So he'd do like the willows and the haystacks and all this kind of thing. And so which ones to put in and how many can I put in, and so it was a lot of stuff, as well as like over his whole life trying to get enough in across different areas. And there's some sections that like I skip, not necessarily skip, but there was like some levels go for like 2 years, other levels go for like 10 or 15 years. So it's like, how do you pick from this whole area of painting? So yeah, pretty difficult.
I won't make you pick a favorite painting. I will respect that because all his artwork's amazing. But can you pick a favorite level?
I think I really do like that purple section. I think that was it was just one of those ideas that I had that I thought I could really go for. And for the listener, essentially the entire level kind of shifts purple over the course of like, a minute or two. And my composer, Steve Shouten, he's just a legend, and he just nailed the music through that part. It was just like, oofed. But I really do like, like one of the things that he did early on in his life was Impression Sunrise, which is what Impressionism was named after. So it's this kind of misty scene with a sun, a very orange sun kind of popping up over it. And it's not particularly, like, I don't look at that painting and think that it's like the best of his paintings. There's others that I like more, just like subjectively what I like. Lady in the Parasol is like a really great image. You could Google that, and it's like, this is the way the light is going through this woman's dress, and it's just a cool image. But Impression Sunrise was this moment in his life where he basically, everyone was trying to, in Paris at the time, trying to get into the Sorbonne, which is like an art gallery that was like run by the rich elite. And so you had to paint their style, and then they would put you up. And that's where people went and viewed painting, right? It was very, very old school. There was no people putting exhibitions on the street or like in other places, right? It was just there. And then rich people showing their art in their own house, right? That was the places that you could see art. So the public could only see it in the Sorbonne. And so, sorry, the Salon, not the Sorbonne. That's a different thing. The Salon. Anyway, basically, and I've probably gotten that wrong too, but basically, so him and his friends were upset that they had this kind of new style of painting that was a bit splashy and a bit like, interesting, as slightly abstracting, right? Than this like basic form of, ornate painting that everyone was doing. And so realistic painting that everyone was doing. And so then him and his mates got together and were like, well, let's just do our own salon. Let's just like hire a space and put our artworks up on the wall and just do that. Who's going to stop us? Like there was like this kind of, nobody had really, I'm sure other parts of the world, they had probably done it and whatnot. But in Western art at that time, that idea was like super punk rock, just like making your own album, in a basement. You do your own art and you just put it up on a wall somewhere and you'd invite people to come and see it. And so he did that. Him and his mates did that. It got like rave reviews. It got massive, tanks. Like everyone was like either loving it or hating it. They didn't know what to do. And one of his major pieces was Impression Sunrise. And a critic said, what is this impressionism? People are just like, they're just flicking up paint and not finishing their artworks, and that's it. They just do an impression of a scene, and then that's it, right? And that name stuck as the genre of that artworks. And I just think it's like a cool story of like how this kind of work. Like now you look at this art and you're like, that's not punk rock. That's like just fuddy-duddy like landscapes, right? But at the time it was revolutionary. And so I just love that painting is, was the kind of pinnacle of that, the kind of apex of all that. And so I set a level all around that artwork. There's you roll this giant orange ball through the level until the very end. It is the sun in the Impression Sunrise. So it's and that's another one of those levels that I kind of like. I had this idea, and it took a long time, and there was a lot of technical issues too with like. Someone dies and then restarts the game. The ball has to do all this stuff where it like bounces around it like behind the scenes and then pops up behind you. Like there's all this technical stuff to make sure that scene could work, right? But it was something that I really wanted to do. I thought it was a really cool concept, and so yeah, it was it took a long time, but I'm proud of that one for sure.
I love that, and I didn't know that that story of how, I guess, controversial and revolutionary Claude Monet was in his time. So that makes me respect, the artist even more. Right? So thank you for the history lesson.
Long-winded, but we got it. Like, it's one of those stories that it's so interesting, I think.